In this video, we're going to take a little bit of a look at a scenario that represents a more real-world type workflow within my Logic app and how we can test that. So the scenario is that we've got a source application that sends messages to Service Bus. We then have two Logic app workflows that work together. So one of them picks messages up from Service Bus, passes them to the second workflow, and then that workflow integrates with the back-end application to load the message and do stuff with it. Now, what we're going to do in this case is we're going to look at how we can use SpecFlow to create tests that will test this process and logic workflow. Now, what we would do, it's quite a common design pattern we use where we separate the receiver from the processor. And I think this makes Logic apps a bit more testable because if you've got everything driven from the service bus, it kind of makes it a bit harder to test certain conditions. And I think by breaking your workflows up into smaller workflows that work together, you tend to make you sacrifice a little bit of latency overhead to do it, but you make workflows that are much more testable in chunks that you can then put together to make a bigger solution. It's a bit like Lego blocks that build a wall kind of thing. Um, so this is the scenario now. In the solution in VS Code, which you can see on GitHub, there's a documentation file I've got here where I've just talked a little bit about this scenario. So we've got the idea that we've got the energy system and the transport system, and the integration platform integrates with both of them and delivers multiple interfaces. This particular interface here, the sequence would be a user would update an order in the energy system. The energy system publishes an event to the API. That hits Service Bus. We then have Logic apps which come along and get a message from Service Bus, makes a call to the energy system to get additional data, transforms the data, creates a flat file, delivers it to the transport system over SFTP, and then it completes the message. So this Logic app line here, this is the bit where our two workflows are working together to solve this problem. And over in the code here, you'll see I've got my ship instruction processor and my ship instruction receiver. Now, in a future video, we're going to look at how you would test the service bus receiver, and we can kind of like split our tests up a little bit and focus on one that just says, can I get a message to service bus? Does it get picked up okay and do some stuff? So you can see here this one would receive a message from service bus. We've just got a couple of shapes where we're reading some data from the message, but then we call this other workflow the ship instruction processor, which actually does the hard work. And if we look in the processor, so you can see here we get a message comes in, we parse the message and check it meets our schema, as you can see here. We then check whether it's a petrochemical message or not. So if it's not, we would log and exit. If it is, we would go and do the lookup. So we're going to call out to a test URL, like a test API I've got here to look some data up. We then run a liquid map. We'd encode a flat file, and we would we would get a response here. Now what I'll do, I'll just show, if I bring up the Azure portal here. So let's go and have a look at a run of that workflow, just so you can see a bit of a flavour of what it would look like in the real world. So here, go to the run history, and we can see, so here we've got the message comes in, you can see we go and look up some data. So you can see we've got a sample message coming back here. We've got our liquid map, so we've got the input here and the XML output that comes out. We then encode it to a flat file, so we, trying to make a real world like message, we get a bit of a nasty old flat file format here that's kind of delimited and that kind of thing. And then we would, I'm not doing the FTP integration here, may add that at some future point, but really just to simulate from testing perspective, we're going to check these actions happen, and then I'm going to return a response. Now, just to make it testable and easy to kind of test, I'm going to return the flat file message, so I can, in my test, I can kind of do some stuff with that message. Okay, so let's take a look at our how we're going to test this now. So if I go down to my acceptance test, then I've got this ship instruction, and then I've got a folder for the processor and a folder for the receiver. And as I say, we'll look at the receiver in a future message. But the processor, you can see we've got quite a lot of stuff going on in here. So in a future video, I've got some information about how to use Living Document, which is where a lot of this text here about adding documentation to your tests really kind of comes into its own. But for the purposes of this video, I'm just going to focus on the actual test itself, and I'd say refer to the Living Document video to learn a bit more how you can get more value out of the test we're writing. But here we've got this feature called Ship Instruction Processor as a transport manager, so that I can associate rail cars to orders. I want the transport system to be notified when an order is ready to be dispatched. And here I've got my scenario. So we've got the green path scenario where we get a notification message which will be generated from this data in the test here. We'll then send a message to the logic app simulating what the source system does, and then we'll receive the message in the workflow. The logic app will parse the message, we'll look the data up, we'll make some assertions against the data from the data that we transport. So I'm going to check that the XML has some nodes in it, for example. And this is where you could kind of do something which would be more realistic of what you need in the real world. We then convert the data to the flat file format. This particular workflow would send a reply, and I'm going to check that the response is what I expect it to be. I've got a second scenario where we had that condition, so I can pass in an event where the commodity field is not petrochemical. So if it was just petrochemical, we'd process it. If it was anything else, we'd exit and throw an error. So here I can just do the similar kind of thing, but I can just have some additional steps that says we identify it's not a petrochemical and we terminate, and I can make sure that error condition's handled properly as well. So this, I can write all of this spec flow definition to describe what my tests are going to do, and then I can create the code behind to be able to implement it. So in the processor steps file, here I've got all the code that executes the test. So we've got the sort of dependency injection and the constructor and everything up here. So we'll talk about that in a separate video. The bit I want to look at really is the kind of steps itself. So we've got our Logic App Test Manager builder. So what we're doing here is we need to create that in the test at some point. And I think a good way to do it is I just put I put a step in the test saying the Logic App Test Manager is set up. So this it only really applies to the automated tests. It's not part of the real execution, but it's a common step we use where we just go and create the client that can execute the workflow, and we pass the name of the workflow, and I just save that to the test context so that it becomes available in future steps. Next up, we've got this step, given we have a request to dispatch an order. So this is where I'm going to create my test input message, and if you remember, so let me just close a couple of these windows down. So in the feature file, we had this key value here. So I'm going to just create an XML input message from that. And you would see here, I'm kind of get this table that SpecFlow passes in. And I'm just using an XML writer to build my sample message so it has a delivery node. And then I'm going to loop over the rows down here and just create the elements in that message. So then basically I'll create a string XML that I save as the request on my test context. So that basically lets me access that XML message in a future step, which you would actually see down in the next step where I'm saying I now send a message to the Logic app. So here, again, in Living Document video, you'll learn a bit more about this line here where we're adding sample messages to the documentation we generate. But here what we're doing is I'm saying create a string content that we can make an HTTP call to the logic app and just use that request XML string as the body, and then we trigger the logic app here from the logic app test manager, and we're just going to save the response to the context. So that's how we trigger the logic app. The step I've got where I say then the logic app will start running, this is where I'm going to check I've got a run ID back in, so the test context response object from that logic app, it should have a run ID property on it. And then I can also load the run history, so we know the workflow should have finished. We can load the run history and we'll be able to use it in subsequent tests. And then here I'm kind of checking next, the logic app will receive the message, so I can get the trigger status from the logic app that we're looking at and just check the status of that trigger was successful. I can then, in the next step, we can say, right, we passed the message, so there should be a shape in the logic app called parse JSON ship event. So we can go back up here. So we've got this shape here where we've got a message where we've converted the XML we passed in, we've converted it to a JSON in this compose shape, and I'm just doing a parse JSON to make sure I've got a good message. So what I'm doing here is I'm going to get the action status for that action and check it was successful. And I can kind of do the same thing as we go down the different steps. So here I'm checking the step the HTTP lookup was successful, which is this one here. So if I'd passed a bad message in and it went down this path, this would be skipped, so my test would fail. And then what we can then do is I've got this next step about the liquid map. So this is where in the Live in Document video you'll see a bit more about how we can use these action input and outputs to put sample messages into the documentation. But what I can also do is I can start off here by saying, did the action succeed? So I'm getting the action status and check it succeeded. And then I'm getting the action input there and the action output. And I'm getting one of them as a JSON object and the other one is a string. And I know that the output, so let me get this right, the output should be XML that we're going to then convert to a flat file. So that would, so if we look down here, so this is where we're running the map, and actually, if I go over here in the run history, you'd see here we've got the JSON we pass in, it comes out from the liquid as an XML that we can use a schema to convert to a flat file. So what I want to do here in my test is actually check, is this XML as I expect? So I'm checking it's got a body, it's got that text as part of the message, so I'm just doing a string check there. But then I can also load it as an XML document, and I can go through the elements and check some of them. Some can check these elements exist. So if we look over here, I think in that step here, what I've got is some names of some of the elements that I'm expecting to be in the message, and I can kind of do some stuff like check they exist and that kind of thing. And then at the end, I'm just writing out to the log the sample messages. So we've checked. I mean, you can kind of go as far as you want here. I'm just checking that the XML's got some of the elements I expect, but you could also do some more detailed tests for certain values depending on what input message you have and that kind of thing. You can really go to town on how much you want to do checking the messages at each of these stages. We've then got the one where we say we'll convert it to the flat file format. So this step here will check that the action completed successfully, and again I can get the message, which is the input and the output. So I can kind of get those input output and convert them to formats where I can check them. So what I'm really looking for here is the output message. I want to check, does it start with this string and does it end with that string here, because they're they're good indications that the message is in the right format. I could do additional checks if I wanted to check other other things in the detail, but that just gives me a good confidence level that the file was formatted correctly. The Logic App sends a reply, so I'm just checking the Logic App response shape was correct. The Logic App completed successfully, so I can check here if I get the workflow run status, was that status successful or not? And then I can also do check the response content from the call to the Logic App, and here I'm just checking was it null, but I could do more detailed checks if I wanted to check the content met a certain format or had certain values in it. And that would cover the majority of my green path test, which is this one at the top here. And then the test where we said, right, we've got a non-petrochemical event and we've got some additional actions to do. This is really where they would check, all these above actions are probably still relevant, bar a few of them, but we're just putting some new steps in here to say, the Logic App will identify it's not petrochemical, so I put a compose shape just to log it went down the other branch of that condition shape. So if we look, we know, this action should be successful, whereas if it went this way, it would show as skipped. And finally, I've got the terminate shape where we check that successfully ran, and then we would expect that the overall workflow status was shown as failed, which is what that terminate shape would make happen. And that's an easy way to check all the actions executed as we would expect in that different scenario, and that gives us a good way of testing our Logic App is the workflow's working as we expect it to. Thanks for listening to the video there.